I am a natural resource management specialist for NOAA Fisheries here in the Pacific Islands region. With that, I'll get started. I would like to keep this pretty informal, so if I'm going through my slides and you have questions, feel free to stop me. We can chat. I have a lot of information. We may not make it through all of it, but I will do my best. Okay, so here's a brief overview of my presentation. I'm going to talk about who we are, NOAA Fisheries, the kind of work that we do, an overview of the fisheries management process, a discussion of the longline fisheries that we manage here in the Pacific Islands. So there's 3 longline fisheries: Hawai'i, Deepset, and shallowset fisheries, and then also the American Samoa longline fishery. And then also a brief discussion about the international and domestic management of tuna species in this region. Okay, so who we are and what we do. The primary law that governs fisheries management in the United States is called the Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. So this law was created, and what it did was set aside exclusive economic zone for the United States. So that's generally the U.S. federal waters from 3 to 200 nautical miles. And inshore of 3 miles is generally managed by the states and territories. Underneath the umbrella of the Stevens Act, regional fishery management councils were created in the United States. So there's regional fishery management councils all over. The Regional Fishery Management Council here is the Western Pacific Fishery Management Council. So these councils were created to a stakeholder involvement in fisheries management. So the council is made up of both state, territorial resource managers, federal representatives, Coast Guard has a seat. There's usually someone in this region from the State Department, because there's such a huge international component to management here. There's representatives of fishing industry as well. And the council is responsible for creating fishery ecosystem plans and fishery management plans for the fisheries that they manage. And then they send these plans to National Marine Fisheries Service, NOAA, where I work, and we're responsible for implementing those plans and implementing the regulations that stem from those plans. So where I work is NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a department under Department of Commerce. And the line office that I work for is the National Marine Fisheries Service. So often we're referred to as NMFS or NOAA Fisheries, and those 2 terms are used interchangeably. As I mentioned, this region is the Pacific Islands region, and we manage programs that support both domestic and international conservation management of living marine resources in the Pacific. So just to get back to some of the laws that we work under, as I mentioned, Stevens Act is the main law. And in addition to creating the fishery management councils, there's also a series of national standards that we adhere to. And so some of the key objectives of that law are to prevent overfishing, rebuild overfished stocks, to increase long-term economic and social benefits of our fisheries, and to ensure a safe and sustainable supply of seafood. So in addition to the Stevens Act, we're also responsible for complying with all other applicable laws, which is pretty broad. I would say the 2 main laws that we work under in addition to Stevens Act are NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which for any federal agency that's implementing a federal action, we're required to analyze the impact to the quality of the human environment. And so every time that we're looking at implementing a Fisheries Management Act, we're required to comply with NEPA and analyze impacts to all of the human environment. So impacts to target and non-target species, protected species that would be managed under the Endangered Species Act, which is another law that we're required to comply with and we work under. And there's a whole host of other laws that we are required to comply with as well. But the main ones are Stevens Act, NEPA, and the Endangered Species Act. And I'll be getting into some of the intricacies of that a little bit farther down my talk. Okay. So where do we work? So this map shows in light blue the exclusive economic zone in the Western and Central Pacific region. So you can see Hawaii in the center of the map. And then, as I mentioned, the exclusive economic zone is out to 200 nautical miles. So that's the whole light blue area. So in addition to the state of Hawaii, this region is also comprised of the Pacific remote island areas. So shown on this map, Johnston, Helen and Baker, Palmyra and Jarvis, and Wake, and also the territories of American Samoa and the territories of Guam and Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Okay. So as I mentioned, one of the roles of the Fishery Management Council is to develop fishery management plans. So beginning in 1987, our council here created a pelagic fishery management plan to govern our pelagic fisheries, which are primarily the longline fisheries, which I'll be discussing in this talk. So that plan was amended several times over the subsequent years, and in 2009, the council replaced that plan with a fishery ecosystem plan. So it incorporated all of the previous plans and amendments, and then took more of an ecosystem-based approach to management. So as I mentioned, the three primary domestic longline fisheries that are managed under the fishery ecosystem plan are the Hawaii longline fisheries, which are the shallowset fishery, which targets primarily swordfish and other billfish, and the Deepset fishery, which targets primarily tuna, and specifically big-eye tuna. And then the third fishery is the American Samoa longline fishery, which I'll get to in a second. So the Hawaii longline fisheries, we tend to manage separately because they are pretty disparate fisheries. They're targeting different species, they're fished in very different ways, and some of the intricacies of the bycatch issues associated with the two fisheries are quite a bit different as well. So we do manage them separately, but they are permitted under the same general Hawaii longline permit. So the Hawaii swordfish or shallowset longline fishery consists of deploying mainline, and in this case, I should have mentioned, longline is defined as having a mainline longer than 1 nautical mile. So when a mainline is being fished shorter than that, it's not considered longlining, it's considered shortlining. So we are talking here about generally the mainlines are much longer than 1 nautical mile. So I think anywhere from, I have actually a slide about that I'll get to. So for shallowset fishery, the hooks are generally deployed at a depth of 25 to 75 meters with about 4 hooks between the floats, and the floats are about 36 meters apart. So they're being fished at a much shallower depth than the deep set. And that's because at night, the swordfish are coming up to the surface to feed. So they're following their prey to the surface. On the other hand, the Hawaii deep set tuna fishery, the hooks are being deployed much deeper. So generally a depth of 40 to 350 meters, and the hooks between the floats quite a bit more. So generally 27 hooks between floats. So shallowset and deepset longline fisheries are access programs. So they're limited by the number of permits that we issue. So access is limited to 164 permits. And if you have a Hawaii longline permit, you can fish either shallowset or deepset. At the outset of a trip, you call in to us, to NOAA Fisheries, and you declare which type of fishing you're going to be doing. And based on that, we determine observer coverage. So observer coverage for our shallowset fishery is 100%. Every shallowset trip that leaves from Hawaii, or from West Coast for that matter, that has a Hawaii longline permit is going to have an observer on board. Whereas for deepset fishery, observer coverage is about 20%. So this again is based on the declaration that's made at the outset of the trip. So the Hawaii shallowset fishery, generally effort in this fishery has been declining. In 2015, 22 vessels completed 68 trips and made about 1,100 sets. So this was 2.8 billion pounds landed with a $2.8 million ex-vessel value. So these are heavily regulated fisheries. In addition to the observer requirements, which I just talked about, and the permit requirements, there's also pretty stringent reporting requirements. All vessels are required to document every single set they make in a federal longline logbook. It has to be recorded within 24 hours of deploying the set. And then those logbooks have to be submitted to our science center within 72 hours of returning from a trip. So we have very good data about these fisheries that helps us manage them sustainably. So in addition to those requirements, we also have large restricted fishing areas around Hawaii and the Pacific Remote Islands, which I have a map I'll show you in a second. There's also annual protected species workshops. So every year, both the permit owner and the vessel captains are required to participate in a 4-hour workshop where we teach safe handling practices for protected species, as well as a number of gear and handling requirements. There's also a VMS requirement for all of our vessels. So that's a vessel monitoring system. So all of these vessels have a satellite system on board, and we have a NOAA Office of Law Enforcement that's constantly monitoring where these vessels are going so that we can make sure that we're complying with all of our restricted fishing areas. Okay. So here's a map that shows fishing effort for a shallow set fishery. So the efforts here given in hooks per square kilometer with increasing effort in the red and orange colors. So you can see the shallow set fishery, one of the other things that distinguishes it from our deep set fishery is where these vessels are fishing. So this fishery is primarily being fished north of the Hawaiian Islands and east to the mainland United States. And these vessels, they're primarily fishing out of Hawaii. They do sometimes dock on US West Coast ports and are able to land fish there, but they're fishing under a permit that we issue here in our Pacific Islands region. Yeah.
Are they restricted in the area where they're outside the 300-mile limit in the same way, or are they free to do whatever they want to?
So because they're permitted under our U.S. longline fishery, they're required to comply with our regulations at all times, regardless of where they're fishing. So that area is the high seas. And so they are allowed to fish on the high seas. There are some different regulations that come into play depending on where they're fishing. So if they're fishing in the exclusive economic zone, that can trigger some other regulations, such as some of our closed area regulations, which I have a map I can show you in a sec. Okay. So as I mentioned before, we have pretty extensive bycatch measures that we've implemented for these fisheries, and particularly for the shallow set fishery. So this fishery historically had high levels of bycatch of seabirds, sea turtles, and marine mammals. And we implemented a host of regulations in the early 2000s to bring these interactions down. And so some of those regulations that we implemented were use of circle hooks, weak circle hooks, that have a lower risk of hooking and entangling turtles. We also have safe handling and release requirements that we teach in the protected species workshops. Again, the weak circle hooks I mentioned. The zone closures, I'll show you on a map in a second. We also have hard caps in the shallow set fishery. So the hard caps are based on our compliance with the Endangered Species Act. So for all of the protected species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act, we're required to do a formal consultation where we analyze what do we think the impact's going to be to these threatened or endangered species. And we come up with a prediction of what do we think the take is going to be. That take then is analyzed against the populations of these species to determine whether that level of take is going to jeopardize the recovery of those species. If we can't get to a no jeopardy conclusion, then we have to implement more mitigation measures until we can reduce the amount of take to levels that are within a non-jeopardy determination. Okay, so as I mentioned, we had historically high levels of take in the shallow set fishery. These regulations, as I mentioned, were implemented in 2004 after a fishery closure. And since we've reopened with the hard caps, all of the safety and handling requirements, and the 100% observer coverage, we managed to keep our interaction levels very low in this fishery. Okay. So as I mentioned, the deep set longline fishery is managed under the same permit program as the shallow set fishery. Again, it's limited to those that have permits, and that's limited to 164 vessels. This fishery, while the shallow set fishery has generally been declining in effort, has been increasing. So this fishery is targeting big eye tuna, and in 2015 landed about 32 million pounds with a value of $91.5 million. So this fishery has the same logbook reporting requirements that I mentioned for the shallow set fishery. They're required to comply with all of the same closed areas, the same protected species workshop requirements. The observer requirement is a little bit different for this fishery. It's 20% rather than 100%. The VMS requirement is the same. So as I mentioned, this fishery is primarily targeting ahi tuna or big eye tuna. Some of the non-target catch for this fishery are other tuna species such as yellowfin, also other pelagic species, so mahi-mahi, ono, mangchang, all common fish that you can find in the market here. As well as several species of billfish, opa, and oilfish. So I think an important thing to note about this fishery is a common thing you hear about in fisheries is bycatch. So bycatch is generally defined as catch that is being discarded, has no economic value. That's generally not the case in these fisheries. Everything that's caught is retained if it has market value. So that's almost every single type of fish that they're catching is being retained and sold because it does have commercial value. The exceptions to this are some species of shark. So there's a few species that do have market value here. I believe thresher is one. Some of the other species that have no market value are released, and generally they're released alive. I think the rate is about 80%. So they try to dehook the sharks and get them overboard as quickly as possible with as little damage as possible. Okay, so as I mentioned, one of the ways in which these fisheries are managed are through closed areas. So here you can see in light gray around the main Hawaiian Islands, as well as the Marianas and American Samoa, are longline fishing prohibited areas. So these vessels are fishing in the pelagic waters, generally pretty far out at sea. You saw on the effort maps, they're generally fishing outside of the exclusive economic zone, so outside of 200 miles. But they're also prohibited from fishing within 50 nautical miles of shore. In addition to those longline prohibited areas, there's also marine national monuments. So that's something that's been in the news a lot lately, and I'm sure you're all familiar with Papahanaumokuakea. So in 2016, President Obama expanded by presidential proclamation that monument boundary out to 200. So longline fishing is prohibited in that entire monument, which is shown by the black dashed lines through the orange. And there's similar restrictions in the Pacific Remote Islands areas monuments, as well as Rose Atoll in American Samoa. So here you can see, again, one of the big differences between the Deepset fishery and the shallowset fishery is where these fisheries are operating. So the Deepset longline tuna fishery is operating closer to Hawaii. So generally to the south between the main Hawaiian Islands and the Prius, and then to the north and to the east. And because these trips are a little bit closer to home, they tend to be a little bit shorter as well. So some of the shallowset trips can be 3 to 4 weeks in length. The Deepset trips tend to be more like 2 to 3 weeks in length. Okay, so the third longline fishery that we manage here in the Western Pacific is the American Samoa Deepset longline fishery. So this fishery is quite a bit smaller than the Hawaii longline fisheries. Access is limited to 60 permits, and they're divided into different size classes, which was done in part to encourage local involvement, so involvement of Native American Samoans in their fisheries. So there's currently only about 20 vessels active in this fishery, and they're mostly those larger size class, those vessels over 70 feet. They're also targeting a different species of tuna. So they're targeting albacore, and they're primarily targeting albacore for the canneries in Pongo Pongo. So in 2015, they landed about 4.7 million pounds of tuna, albacore, with a value of $4.7 million. This fishery is subject to almost all of the same requirements that I discussed for the Hawaii longline fisheries. So the same permit and reporting requirements, the same annual protected species workshops, the same gear and handling techniques for protected species interactions, and also a 20% observer coverage. So the same as the Deepset fishery here in Hawaii. So as I mentioned, the target catch in this fishery is albacore tuna, so apakoa in Samoan. And some of the non-target catch in that fishery is yellowfin, skipjack, big eye. Again, some billfish species, moonfish, oilfish, wahoo. And this fishery is also very similar to the Hawaii fisheries in that, again, there's almost no bycatch because all the fish that's caught that has commercial value is kept and either landed at the canneries, or if the canneries won't accept it, it's retained locally and generally, if not sold in market, distributed among the villages that the crew and the vessel owners are from. So here's a fishing effort map for American Samoa. One of the challenges for this fishery is you can see on the map here, whereas Hawaii is surrounded by a huge amount of high seas, American Samoa's EEZ is surrounded by the EEZs of other countries. So right here is the closest you can get to the high seas if you're departing from American Samoa. So that is challenging for their fishery, and one of the reasons that this fishery's effort is decreased in recent years. So some of the management issues that we've been dealing with currently in American Samoa is, I don't know if you can see on this map, there's roughly a square, like a rectangle here where there's no fishing. And so half of that is Rose Atoll Marine National Monument, where longline fishing is prohibited. The other half is what's called a large vessel prohibited area. So it's similar to the longline prohibited area around the main Hawaiian Islands. So this fishery has been struggling economically for a number of years. And one of the things that the council did in 2015 and 2016 was implement an exemption to that large vessel prohibited area. So it would allow some of these larger longline vessels to fish a little bit closer to shore. So not all the way into shore, but as opposed, so it used to be they couldn't fish within 50, it moved that boundary up to 25. And so the hope was that the two things that were causing the fishery to struggle were fuel prices had gone up and counter prices had gone down. So the hope was if they didn't have to travel as far to catch their fish, they could make more money. So that recommendation was made by the council and implemented by National Marine Fisheries Service in 2016. Sadly, we were sued over that decision by the American Samoa government. And I think this is an interesting case study in what we do, because I think a large part of what happened was there was a lot of misinformation. And this is something that's so difficult about fisheries management in this region. And I wish I had included this as a map, but in the first map I showed of all of the EEZs in the Western Pacific, that whole area is larger than all of the continental United States. So it's a huge area to manage, and the cultures and practices of the territories in the state of Hawaii are all vastly different. And there's a real challenge in stakeholder, community-based fisheries management when you have that disparate of a cultural and regional structure that you're dealing with. So there was a lot of miscommunication, I think, about this action, and it was not a popular decision. So we're currently in litigation over that decision, but the judge found in favor of American Samoa government and remanded the rule. So that exemption to the large vessel prohibited area is no longer in place. So essentially just moved the boundary back to where it had been at 50 nautical miles. So again, I think it's an interesting case study, and it really shows some of the challenges we deal with.
Are most of the 40 boats in the program owned by residents of American Samoa?
Yeah, they are. And actually, it's a little interesting. There's no prohibition against owning both an American Samoa longline permit and a Hawaii longline permit. And so there are actually several permits that are owned by the same people. And so there's several longline vessels here in Hawaii that own American Samoa longline permits as well. And the reason behind that I will get to in the international management section. It's pretty interesting.
But the objection that American Samoa had was against local fishermen that had not.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that we originally implemented the large vessel prohibited area was there was a fear, and it hadn't been demonstrated, but there was a fear that their local small boat fishermen, they're called Aliyah fishermen, and they're primarily doing trolling, targeting bottom fish. There was a fear that there would be gear conflicts between them and the long-line vessels. And so that was the idea, was that the smaller boats could fish inside that area, and then the larger long-line vessels had to fish outside that area. So this is something, we monitor the catch data for all of these fisheries, and we've been monitoring it since we put this large vessel prohibited area in place, and there was no evidence of any kind of gear conflict. And in fact, the smaller vessels we were trying to protect had no demonstrated fishing at all. So they weren't fishing. And so it seemed, in addition to the larger longline vessels struggling economically, the reason that we put it in place had never come to fruition. The conflict we were trying to avoid never even happened. So those were sort of the reasons that we had tried to go for the exemption. But I think, again, I think there was a lot of miscommunication and a lot of fear. And perhaps we didn't do a good enough job working with the community and working through some of those issues before going forward with the implementation. But again, that's, it's good because it demonstrates, the real challenges that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So the other territories that I hadn't discussed are Guam and Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. So since 2011, there's not been any longline fishing activities in those areas. But historically, there were fewer than 3 longline vessels fishing there. So we have to protect the data confidentiality for these fishermen. And so I can't show effort maps or discuss really any of that kind of fishing activity because it's less than 3 vessels. So usually you have to aggregate that data, but there's not enough data to aggregate. So again, even though there's not currently any longline fishing being done there, there's nothing preventing them from developing longline fisheries. And in fact, we have a mechanism in place to help develop their fisheries. But the sense that I've gotten from being there and talking to the fishermen is the challenge is finding the markets. So, here in Hawaii, there's strong demand for fresh caught fish, and I think there's a little bit less of a demand there, as well as a strong import market that keeps prices down and would kind of prevent them from being competitive. Okay. So in addition to the domestic management that I've been discussing, we're also in the interesting position of having to comply with international management. So there's a number of commissions, different treaty organizations that do international fisheries management in the Pacific Ocean. So to the west, you have the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission managing what's called WCPO Big Eye. So managing a stock of Western and Central Pacific Big Eye tuna. And then to the east, you have the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission managing Eastern Pacific Big Eye tuna. So the United States is considered a member country to these two commissions, and as such, we comply with the limits that they set for these species. So these species are managed on a quota system, and they do stock assessments. They're updated frequently, I wouldn't say every year, but every few years they update these stock assessments to see what is the status of these stocks. And generally the status is what you're looking for are the stocks subject to overfishing, which is sort of like a yellow light, slow down, or are they subject to being overfished, which is like a red light, you really need to back off the fishing pressure, let the stock recover. So the WCPO Big Eye tuna stock is considered subject to overfishing, but not overfished, whereas the EPO Big Eye tuna stock is neither overfished or subject to overfishing. So we generally are managed under the WCPFC limits. So those quota limits are quite a bit higher. The EPO limit is roughly 500 metric tons every year of quota that the United States gets from that from the IATTC, but that quota only applies to vessels larger than 24 meters. And for the WCPFC, because that stock is subject to overfishing, the quotas that the member countries receive are being reduced each year in an attempt to rebuild that stock. So you can see here the reduction in quota over the years from 2014 to 2017. So in 2014, the WCPFC quota for the United States was 3,763 metric tons, and then reduced each subsequent year. So some of the discrepancies that you can see here, for example, 2015 is lower than 2016, is we're monitoring our catch very closely. And in years where we have an overage, we take the overage off the next year's quota. So that's why the quota in 2016 is actually higher than 2015. And then here you can see 2017, the limit is 3,138 metric tons. So the United States as a member country is subject to these quotas. American Samoa, Guam, and Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands are considered participating territories under these agreements. So they're considered to be like a small island developing state, which is similar to like Micronesia. So because they don't have the really well built up longline fisheries that the other member countries have, for example, like Japan, China, Taiwan, they're not subject to these quota limits. And so what our council has done is limits under the auspices of the Nexus Students Act. So every year we implement limits for our territories. So American Samoa, Guam, and CNMI, we implement a 2,000 metric ton limit for each territory. We then allow those territories to transfer half of that quota, 1,000 metric tons, to a longline fishing vessel that's permitted under our pelagic fishery ecosystem plan. And in return, the longline vessels either have to land that catch in the territory that they bought it from, or they have to put that money into a marine conservation plan. And that money then becomes available to fund fisheries development projects in the territories.
The money you're referring to is a penalty for taking it the wrong place, or?
No, it's not. It's not. It's It's sort of like the cost of doing business. I think the idea is the quota that the United States is getting each year, it's based on a historical amount of quota that the U.S. had fished, and it's not enough for the Hawaii longline fishery to fish through the calendar year. Generally, we hit the WCPFC limit around summer, so August, September. And as you all probably know, one of the biggest times for ahi tuna here is around Christmas and New Year's. And so to have the fisheries closed down at that point is a huge hit for the industry. And so this was an effort to be proactive about setting limits for the territories, while also setting up a mechanism to allow the territories to sell some of their quota to Hawaii so that they could keep the longline fisheries open till the end of the calendar year, while also then funding fishery development programs in the territories.
Where can we find information on scientific research regarding the big eyes?
Like the stock assessments that they base this on? That's a great question. So the WCPFC is setting the limits, and there's a Secretariat of the Pacific that does the stock assessments. So I think you can find a lot of that information online. I can give you my card afterwards, and I can tell you more about that. But so in addition to, when we're thinking about setting these limits for the territories each year, we're still required to comply with not just our international obligations to help prevent overfishing and help reduce the overfished status of the stock. We're also required to comply with NEPA, Endangered Species Act, all of the other laws I discussed earlier. So every single year that we're setting these limits for the territories and allowing some portion of the limit to be transferred, we go through a process of doing basically a stochastic modeling exercise where we take the stock assessments from the SPC and then we add this additional fishing effort to it to make sure that we're not actually jeopardizing the rebuilding plan for these stocks. We do that every single year. And if the council recommended a limit and we ran these models and found that it did in fact jeopardize the rebuilding status of the stock, we would be forced to disapprove that action. So the council makes a recommendation to us, and we can either approve, disapprove, or partially approve those recommendations. And we have to base that on the best available science.
Is that a hard approve or disapprove, or can the fisheries come back and say, well, we don't like it?
So we can't. So it's either approve, disapprove, or partially approve. And so, say for example, the council wanted to recommend allowing a transfer of like 5,000 metric tons or something. And we went through the stochastic modeling exercise and found that that did in fact jeopardize the rebuilding status of big eye tuna in the WCPO. We would have to disapprove that action. And at that point, the council would have to go back to their advisory bodies. They would have to probably, at the next council, so the council meets 3 times a year. They would probably have to either convene an emergency meeting or something along those lines and come up with another recommendation. Right, and we would give them our rationale or justification for disapproval, and then that would give them the information they needed to think, okay, well, let's go back to the drawing board and figure out what's a limit that we can recommend that still meets our international obligations and complies with our domestic laws.
So this switching of up to 1,000 metric tons is per territory?
Yes, correct.
So, and how much is allocated to the Hawaii portion? Because this is just on the territory, so.
Right, so each of the 3 territories, and this is what we've done for the last three or 4 years, each of the territories is given a limit of 2,000 metric tons, and they're allowed to transfer half of it, so 1,000 metric tons.
Okay, so Hawaii boats can get 3,000 total from them. How much do they start with?
They're starting with these numbers. So generally around 3,000, 3,500 metric tons is the limit we get from the WCPFC. And that amount, that 3,000, 3,500 metric tons, usually carries the fishery through about the first 6 or 7 months of the year. And so the way the fishery agreements are done, so they're called specified fishing agreements. It's essentially first come, first serve. So the first territory to the board with an offer to the longline vessels that's acceptable is adopted. And generally, we don't use 3 agreements in a year. Generally, just 2 agreements gets us to the end of the year. And usually we don't even utilize all of the second agreement. So for example, I think last year, the total big eye tuna catch was probably, I want to say, around 5,000 metric tons. So it's not, we didn't fish. So I think what you're getting at is realistically, you could under this scheme fish the 4,000 plus an additional 3,000, so 7,000. But that's not what we're actually seeing happen in reality. What we're seeing happen in reality is the fisheries just buying as much quota as they need to carry them to the end of the year. And generally, it's less than an additional 2,000 metric tons. Okay. So this is basically what I was talking about. So in 2014, there was just 1 agreement, and that was with CNMI. In 2015, there were 2 agreements, CNMI and Guam, and then in 2016, again, same 2 agreements. Okay, so as I mentioned, one of the benefits to the territories of doing this is those funds then are put into, they're able to be used for funding projects that are specified in each territory has what's called a marine conservation plan. And so every year the territories create a plan and they think about what kinds of projects they want to implement to meet their goals and objectives for developing their domestic fisheries. And so some examples are of things that we've funded through these marine conservation plans are putting in ice machines and longline docks in American Samoa. So here's a picture of the dock in Pago Pago, and you can see the old dock was so short that the vessels all had to be tied side by side. So some of the funding was able to extend those longline docks. There was also construction of a fishing platform in Guam and improvements to the Garapan fishing base in CNMI. So something else that I think is interesting to think about when you're thinking about, that our international obligation is to adopt this quota, but it's only carrying us so far through the year, and then we're relying on these quota transfers with the territories to get us through the calendar year of fishing is sort of what would happen if we didn't have that in place. So if the fishery hit its WCPFC big eye tuna quota in August and had to shut down for the rest of the year, the demand for ahi, I think, especially in Hawaii, certainly wouldn't go away. And I think what you see then in that case is a lot of imported tuna. And so, just going to Costco, every other weekend, I always look and I see, where is this fish coming from? And frequently it's, Indonesia, Thailand, and those places do not have the strict regulations that we have in place. They don't have the strict compliance with environmental laws. They don't have the observer coverage that we have. They don't have any of the logbook reporting requirements we have or the VMS requirements we have. And so one of the things that you see is what's called transfer effects. So if our fisheries, our well-regulated fisheries here are shut down and the demand for ahi doesn't go away, then people are going to be buying imported ahi. And so the impacts to, for example, sea turtles, dolphins, seabirds, all of those things are just being transferred to somewhere else in the world. And so I think that's something interesting that a lot of people maybe don't think about when they're thinking about sort of the complexities of this domestic and international regulation, and what it means to have access to well-regulated, locally caught seafood. Okay, so that's my presentation, and happy to take questions. I also brought, I'm sorry I didn't bring more copies, but I brought copies of what we call a small entity compliance guide. So anytime we implement regulations, one of the things we do is we develop sort of just like it's meant to be like an easy to read companion manual almost to our regulations, because some of our regulations can be just a beast to get through. So I have several compliance guides over there. And they're also available online, and I can show you guys where to find those. But it has a really good, easy to read description of a lot of the things I talked about tonight. So thanks.
How much does a permit cost?
That is a great question. So there is a fee that we charge, and I think it's less than $100. It's not very expensive, but the actual value and cost of the permit is quite a bit more. Because as you can imagine, this fishery is it makes quite a bit of money. So these permits are more valuable than the minimal processing fee that we charge for them. So if you were to actually try to buy a permit, because they're limited, I don't actually know what the going rate is, but I imagine it's thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I imagine it's quite expensive. I don't actually know. So I think if you meet the requirements and you keep applying every year and you don't lose your permit, I think you can essentially have it in perpetuity, more or less. Yeah. So, but the fisheries are a little bit different. So American Samoa has more stringent requirements for holding a permit. And again, that was meant to incentivize more local involvement in their fishery. So, yeah.
So a permit specifies the catch that's allowed for that particular vessel?
No, it allows you to fish legally, longline fish legally, commercially in our fishery. So that the amount that you can catch.
Theoretically, take it off. And as soon as they report that they're over the limit, then you would have to cut them off. Everyone.
Theoretically, yes. But one of the things that I think people don't realize about these fisheries is the actual catch rates are very low. It's extremely laborious. They have to do so much work to catch very little fish. I mean, it's backbreaking, and the returns are not what you would necessarily expect. So I don't really think one vessel could actually catch the U.S. quota. Yeah. I'm sorry, sir, did you have a question?
So NOAA Fisheries doesn't issue a permit now.
We do. Yes.
So
Yes.
Where's Westcott?
So the council, the Western Pacific Fishery Management Council, they have created the umbrella fishery management plan that sort of governs these fisheries. So they're responsible for creating that fishery management plan and recommending regulations that we then adopt. So the creation of that limited access permit program was recommended by the council and then adopted by National Marine Fisheries Service.
So who's in charge here? Is Westcott in charge or is NOAA Fisheries?
I mean, it's sort of, I don't want to say co-managed, but the way Nexus Students Act set up fisheries management in the United States is that the councils are meant to manage the fisheries, and that's because they're meant to be a stakeholder-based group. They're meant to represent multiple interests, but they can only recommend regulations and management measures to National Marine Fisheries Service. And then, as I said, we can either approve, disapprove, or partially approve those recommendations. So, does that make it clear? We keep the regulations, we make the regulations, everything, that's all, it's all codified in what's called the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, the ECFR. So all of those regulations can be found online. And that's essentially what my job is. So we implement those regulations. And we make sure that anything the council recommends complies with all applicable laws. So Nexus Students Act, NEPA, ESA, Administrative Procedures Act. So, yeah.
So if you're fishing outside the 200-mile zone,
If you want to land your fish legally in the United States, you need the permit. Yeah. You can fish illegally. I don't recommend it, because we enforce these fisheries pretty heavily. I mean, in addition to, yeah.
You just didn't land legal fishing to go to Mexico.
I think you would probably have a hard time finding a market in any country without some sort of permit. But theoretically, yes. And actually, illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, IUU fishing, is a huge issue that NOAA is working towards addressing. And one of the things I mentioned was the VMS, the vessel monitoring systems. So that's one way that we're able to make sure that all of our vessels are fishing legally. So, but again, not all vessels have that. So, yeah.
Who does the enforcing?
So we have our own branch of law enforcement, NOAA Office of Law Enforcement, and they do things like dockside inspections, investigations into, if like there was allegations of shark finning or something like that, they would do those kinds of investigations. We also have a huge Coast Guard presence here and a Navy presence. So it's really, it's a joint effort, especially with this region being so far flung. and with a lot of marine national monuments that cover huge expanses. It's kind of a joint effort, I would say.
So does the IATTC and the WCPFC have separate fishing programs? Do they get their data separately for the stock assessment?
Right, so I think they're using a lot of the same data, but the quotas are set separately. And as I mentioned, they're different amounts. The amount that the U.S. Is allocated under IATTC is quite low. It's only 500 metric tons, which is not very much. It's pretty complicated, but we do actually keep track of where the big eye tuna is being caught so that we can actually track it back to, should we count it against the WCPFC limit or the IATTC limit? Do we count it towards a Hawaii longline permit or an American Samoa longline permit? Because again, there's some vessels that have both. So it's quite complicated, but yeah, we're monitoring that and tracking that.
Is that data in the stock assessments, the data of how you
Yes.
guys track these fish or how you
Yeah, so,
usually track them because they're pelagic, right?
right. Yeah, so the stock assessments rely heavily on the data that's collected by the member countries. So all of the data that we collect through our logbooks and through our observer program is then fed back to the treaty organizations that we're a part of to help inform those stock assessments. Yeah.
So observer data is used in stock assessment as well.
I think it is used to some extent, yes. I would say generally, in my experience of managing the fisheries, what we rely heavily on the observer data for is for managing for protected species interactions, because it's such good data, and often there's photos, video, there's the firsthand account from the observer. Often, I think the logbook data is probably more regularly used to inform the stock assessments, but you can also do a good comparison, right, between the two to make sure that logbook data is matching up to what's being observed. So I believe they do checks like that as well at the Science Center. Yeah. Are you an observer?
Yeah. Is there any work done for site setting? Because I know it was required before, and there was stipend given out, right? For folks to site set.
Right,
And now a lot of them are setting at the rear.
sure.
And there's data that cites setting boats, catch less birds.
Mhm.
And so I was wondering if there's any work done to put that requirement back as a hard requirement.
So I think it is still a hard requirement, but only if you're fishing north of 23, 27. It's in that compliance guide over there. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it is still a requirement, but only if you're fishing north of a certain latitude. And actually, we actually have somebody on detail to our office who's studying that exact question. Yeah, and so this is a good example of something that we do often as well. Is as I mentioned, these are very well managed fisheries, but you can always do better. You could always reduce interactions. You can always reduce bycatch, and so that's something that if we start to see, for example, in the last year or two, I think we started seeing interactions with laceline albatross or black-footed albatross creeping up a little bit. So the council made a recommendation to their science advisory body to look into it. And so they're working closely with our science center, with the observer program, and with us at the regional office to analyze that trend. And if we see that that's something that is in fact a problem for the species, then we would potentially start looking at mitigation for it. And one of those might be an expansion of that regulation, the mandatory side setting or something along those lines. Yeah.
Any other questions?